The visual style of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is just incredible, as it's the first ever film to achieve the goal of truly looking like a beautiful, handcrafted fairy tale come to life. However, it turns out that there is actually a pretty big reason as to why this film was the first to do so, because it was just a ridiculously hard challenge to pull this off. So much so that the filmmakers basically had to take the entire way that CGI would traditionally work and just break that completely in half just to have a chance of getting this to remotely function. Because traditionally, the world of CGI has grown up around the pursuit of creating realism, from visual effects to games to animation to architectural visualization. Pretty much every major use of the technology is attempting to mimic reality. And so this means that the overarching way that all of these tools work tends to bend towards creating objects which conform to the rules of our world. And so this is why, whilst other projects may have a strong sense of art direction, or perhaps have a bit of a painted style to them, very few of them actually manage to break out of those trappings of reality in that same special way that The Last Wish did. And so that's why I sat down with the film's visual effects supervisor, Mark Edwards, to understand why it looked like a painting, why this was so difficult to do, and why The Last Wish was basically the first ever CGI film to actually be able to do this. So, to explore all of this and more, get your boots on and just give up on life as we dive into the beautiful hand-painted world of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. So even though this film is part of the Shrek cinematic universe, why did this film's director, Joel Crawford, and the rest of his team choose to go for this painted style even though no other films in the franchise look anything like this? Well, as Mark explained to me, ever since the first few Shrek films came out in the early 2000s, CGI technology has just grown massively, to the point where, back in 2004, just making Puss's cape move naturally was already a really difficult challenge for the team at Dreamworks. And so that's why he just chucks it away within the first few seconds of appearing, because that way the poor animators wouldn't have to deal with it anymore after that one scene. And so yeah, sure, the filmmakers could have just made another film with this nowadays kind of old school style, and it probably would have worked out fine. But really, they wanted to capitalize on these years of CGI growth and start doing something completely new and completely different with their visuals. And so given that Shrek is already a fairy tale world, the team at Dreamworks began to dive into pieces of artwork and illustration around fairy tales in search of inspiration, and slowly the hand-painted style of these illustrations began to bleed through and form the ideas and the backbone behind this film's visual design, which I personally think is a really great idea, as this focus on fairy tales strikes this perfect balance of the old and the new, as it let them masterfully change up the film's visual style without stepping too far away from the pre-established Shrekverse, and therefore easily kept this film from feeling too disconnected from the rest. However, despite all of these years of technological advancements I was just talking about, there was still a pretty big reason as to why no other film had ever really attempted this painted style of 3D animation ever before. Because to take this film away from reality and make it look genuinely artistic and genuinely hand-painted, Mark explained that the team at Dreamworks wanted to break up the edges of the different shapes you see on screen in this splotchy way, as this would replicate that same feeling you get in a painting where the artist has just about gone outside of the lines. And so creating a system that could deform their objects in this splotchy way was already a massive technical innovation that this film pulled off. But what I found even more impressive than this was not only how they then went and made this innovation completely art directable down to the tiniest little detail, but also how they did this in a way where it wouldn't take their artists forever to actually be able to do so. Because a large point of a painting is, of course, to look nice. And so oftentimes this going outside of the lines is not an accident and is instead a very deliberate artistic choice that is specifically crafted to flow with the shapes and the colors on the canvas. And so to be able to mimic the deliberate beauty of a painting's edge breakup, and to be able to do so for an entire film's worth of objects, this is where the Last Wish team sat down and eventually developed this fantastic system they called CEO, or crap encapsulating objects, which rather than making artists come in and meticulously pull apart all of these different edges by hand to craft that splotchiness, would instead randomly scatter these points all across the object and then have these points drive that edge break up for them. Because by using this point system rather than hand making everything, they could not only just scatter it and rapidly make any object look splotchy and painted within seconds, but it also meant that the artist then had the power to come in and specifically control each of these points to change the effect it had on that object's splotchiness, so that that area of that object could be controlled to look as absolutely aesthetic as possible on camera. And so this means when you can take control on a micro level like this, and then you zoom out to see how that would be distributed across an entire scene's worth of objects to make them look beautiful, then we can begin to see that them adding this painted edge to all of these objects wasn't just a thing they did, but was instead a genuinely massive and deliberate artistic effort that balanced the en masse scattering against that meticulous individual control, all with the aim of taking this film one step closer to achieving this special painted look that no other film has even gotten close to creating. But now, as brilliant as this was, giving the actual shapes this splotchy look was only actually half of the battle. But before we get to that, I just wanted to quickly talk about the paid partner of today's video, Betterhelp. Because in 2020, I was really struggling quite badly with anxiety, and I let it get to the point where I thought I probably need to go to a therapist to talk through these issues. Because I was always under the impression that you have to be struggling quite a lot to go to therapy. And so it was only after waiting a very long time to go that I realized just how helpful it was to talk things through with a professional. Because not only did it provide a safe space and professional guidance that could help me deal with these issues, but it also helped me work through quite a lot of other problems that I had going on parallel to this anxiety that I just let build up for years. And by the end of it all, I just thought, why didn't I do this sooner? And so that's why I wanted to discuss today's paid partner, Betterhelp. Because what I always found difficult about going to therapy was finding a therapist with availability who was reasonably near to you and who was also actually suitable for helping you with your specific issues. But with Betterhelp being an online service, they make it so much easier to actually get a good therapist who can genuinely help you. Because firstly, they make sure that the therapists on the platform are well qualified to the point where they have over 7,000 reviews and a 4.5 rating on Trustpilot. And secondly, to find a good match, all you have to do is fill out a questionnaire and they'll usually match you with a therapist within just a couple of days. And so I was happy with the one I got matched with. But if it's not a good fit for you, then you can just switch to another one, easy as that. So if you are struggling, consider therapy with our paid partner, Betterhelp, and click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/CGY for a discount on your first month of therapy. And with that, now back to the video and back to how making this splotchy look was only actually half of the battle. Because for the film to look like it was genuinely hand painted, then of course the film's actual color palette itself should also have this handcrafted appearance, where we as the audience got the feeling that these models were, much like a real painting, genuinely formed out of many individual brushstrokes that are all very slightly different to each other, which again is not really something that CGI lends itself too well to creating. Because when it comes to manipulating the color of your CG object, the standard approach is to apply this thing called a material to your geometry. And so this is basically where different images or textures can be plugged into different parts of the CG object to define how that object should interact with light. So for example, one image can set the color of an area, and then another could set how reflective that same area feels, and then another could set how metallic that area is. And so this is another of those major cornerstone techniques designed to make CGI mimic reality, because all of these properties are often stacked up on top of each other to accurately recreate the same kinds of materials that we see in real life. But like we said, they didn't want the materials we see in real life. And so to achieve their goal of bringing individuality to each stroke, and to do so on the massive scale of every object in the movie, this is where, once again, the Last Wish team bent the reality-based shackles of CGI to do something really simple but also really brilliant. Because, as Mark explained to me, what they decided to do is scatter loads and loads of paint stroke textures across all of the different models in the scene. But the trick was that each of those paint stroke textures would only feed into one of those many different types of material properties. So for example, some would affect, say, only the reflectivity channel, whilst others may affect only the color channel, meaning that each individual stroke would now look at and interact with light very slightly differently to every other stroke around it, because now it was interacting with a completely different part of the physical makeup of that material, making it so that now, within seconds, that model truly felt like it was made up of many handcrafted brushstrokes. And so, with this tool, the Last Wish team really started taking this painted aesthetic rapidly to the next level, going to the point where they were even scattering paint textures into their lights as well, so that now even their lights felt hand painted, all of which truly began to bring this entire fairy tale aesthetic to life. Which in fact brings me to the third and final key to creating this painted look, which was nailing the way that light hits and interacts with all of these different painted objects. Because you can have the most hand-painted looking CG objects in the world, but if they're not lit like a painter would light them, then your entire movie is just going to stumble visually at this last hurdle. And so this is where, once again, the way that CGI arcs towards realism above anything else came into be yet another major problem. Because the typical way that CGI lights get calculated and rendered is that in order to look realistic, they mimic the exact way in which light rays bounce in real life, where essentially they emit from a singular point and then kind of just bounce around for ages until they finally run out of energy, which in turn creates all of those highlights, shadows, and other millions of little individual variances in brightness and tone that you see in real life. But of course, in a handmade painting, there's no way that an artist would sit down forever and add in things like those millions of little individual variances in lighting and tone and color and shadow and God knows what else on like one blade of grass amongst many. And so this is why all across this film, the artist constantly took very specific steps to essentially compress all of that naturally generated CGI detail down in a way which could match the lesser detail that you'd see in a painting. And my favorite example of this can be seen in just how simply, but also how absolutely brilliantly they bent their fire effects away from reality and instead towards the painted. Because with fire in real life being this absurdly detailed thing, it means that their CGI counterpart, which is designed to mirror reality, is now, like with everything else, just way too dense and detailed to be anything like a painting. And so again, rather than going back and reinventing the wheel and creating a whole new paint-based fire system, the team at Dreamworks instead got their big, complicated 3D fire simulations and simply just compressed all of that detail down into these simple two-dimensional videos that they played on these little two-dimensional cards. And in doing this, they very naturally gave the fire that much simpler sense of detail, therefore naturally making it feel so much more like a painting. And so, speaking of flatness, another brilliant example of reducing and flattening this detail can also be seen in things like the characters' fur coats. As typically to look good, CGI fur needs to be generated with a very dense amount of fur curves, and I'm talking like millions and millions of fur curves, which again is not really something that you're looking for in a painting. And so, to overcome this, all the Last Wish team would do is very tactically blur their furry characters with this painterly filter, which could simply just mush all of that fur detail together just like a painter would. And so when you throw stuff like this in with all of the other little techniques this film used, like the heavy use of rim lights to make their characters pop out from the background, or the use of depth of field which helped them blur out even more detail, we can see that a large amount of the visual style of this film is also coming from a series of little tricks that are all stacked up on top of each other to slowly eliminate the little bits of detail and variance and realism that modern CGI techniques love to generate for you. But now, when I say eliminating detail, it wasn't like they were just nuking all of this randomly, but instead this was very often a tactical, artistic choice. Because, as Mark explained, maintaining a degree of physical complexity amongst a lot of this lesser detail was absolutely crucial to the visual storytelling of this film. For example, in the scenes where death shows up, Puss's fur has to narratively react to this, and so when it came to removing the detail from this fur, it had to become this very meticulous balancing act of both blurring out the detail whilst also mixing in these kind of standout guide furs which could be used to narratively direct the overall energy of the fur's reaction, all just so that the artist could balance both the aims of the narrative against the aims of the visual style. Which I think brings me to the core of all of this, that at every step along the way, something in this film had to be intelligently changed from the standard way that it was done. And so we could probably sit here and pore over every little frame of this film and highlight just how much effort and artistry went into each and every one of them. But basically, the point I'm trying to highlight here is that when you put all of this together, we can really see that The Last Wish is the perfect example of working within your limitations, bending that pre-existing CGI formula to its very limits to both push the boundaries of the art form whilst also truly bringing the audience something completely new and completely different. But what do you guys think? Are there any other 3D animated movies that are as ambitious as The Last Wish? And how do you think this will change the future style of the Shrek cinematic universe? And I just wanted to give a massive thank you to Mark and Jerry and Nairi and everyone else both at and outside of Dreamworks who helped me put this video together. And I'd also love to give another massive thank you to all of my Patreon subs. Because of your support, I was able to source this interview with Mark, which helped make this video 10 times better, and I was also able to set up all of this ridiculous camera nonsense and film this whole video like 7 times until I was actually happy with it. So thank you so much again.